In this part of the module, I'm going to talk about budgeting. So what do I mean when I say budgeting? Now, budgeting means how much money are you going to invest in communication, say, in a given period within, for example, a fiscal year. So how much money are you going to invest, and how are you going to come to the decision on how much money to invest? So what kind of methods could you use? Now, if you look what's out there in terms of budgeting methods, there are two broad classes. Now, one of them being heuristic methods, and the other ones being analytic methods. Now, I suspect, or from what I've seen in practice, that typically, I think this is changing because it's becoming more scientific, that typically firms will use some kind of heuristic method. So meaning the decision that they will make, they will follow some kind of implicit rule. Now, but that rule need not be necessarily true or optimal. It's maybe some kind of rule of thumb that they use, which may work for them, but there's no clear evidence that it's the best rule. Now, and you know, what are these kind of heuristic rules? So one very popular one is, well, just to use the budget of the previous period, right? So when companies sit down at the beginning of the year and think, well, how much money am I going to invest in communications in this year? Well, let's see what we did last year, and just use the same kind of budget. This has worked for us, and let's do that. Now, another popular one is, and probably more popular than the first one, is the percentage of sales or profit, right? So a firm will say, well, how much money do I need to invest? Well, let's take so we're in an advertising-heavy industry, say consumer goods. We need to invest lots of money. Let's take 20%. 20% of what we earned last year, we will invest in communications. We've always done that. Now, and I think this is pretty popular because it's easy. Now, but I think also it's plain wrong, right? So let's assume that you're not very successful as a company. Your profits go down. And then you say, well, I'm going to invest 20% of the little that I've earned, I'm going to use for communication. Now, remember what I said at the very beginning, that communication is an investment that will allow you to achieve a goal, say, in terms of sales or profits. Now, if you're selling very little, if you're not very profitable, well, there may be a reason for that. And the reason could be, at least, that people will say don't like your brand, that your communication is not very good, that people don't understand what your product does, and so forth. Now, that should be a warning sign for you to invest more. On the other hand, if you're very successful, if people love your brand, love your products, now, why keep spending more on advertising? Right? I think, for instance, Apple, at least for the last years, they do relatively little advertising for a firm their size now, and the reason could be that people love their products anyway, so they don't need to invest as much as other firms to make up that gap. Now, it could also be based on the available funds. How much money do I have? So what the competitive activities are. So how much money is a competition investing, and you try to match that. Now, it could also be based on your objectives, right? Now, this is already a bit better, right, than just saying, well, I'm going to take what I spent last year. Now, basing it on your objectives, now that's a bit better, because you could say, well, depending what the challenge is, say to reposition the brand or to make people understand what the product is, well, there's different kinds of money or funds that are necessary for achieving each of these goals, right? But still, it's a heuristic. Now, what's more scientific or more objective, or more related to the impact that the communications is meant to achieve, are what's called analytic methods. I'm just going to talk about them very briefly because I don't have the time and the space here. Now, just to give you a general idea of what's involved here. Now, if you're talking about analytical budgeting methods, you are assuming some kind of advertising response function. So again, remember what we said. Now, we invest in communications in order to achieve a certain result or a consequence, right? So I invest as a company because I want to sell more product. Now again, this can be some kind of functional relationship, right? So I do A, I invest in advertising, then B happens, I sell less or more. Now, so what they say is now there's an advertising response function that demand for a product X now is depending on A, the advertising spend. Now this is something that we know that we talked about in the pricing module, where we talked about the demand function, right? So the price being dependent, demand being dependent on the price that you set for your product, right? Now, you could construe the same in terms of advertising. So I advertise and something else happens. The key difference between the advertising response function and the price response function being that the price response function is typically negative, right? So you go up with the price, demand goes down, whereas the advertising response function is typically positive, right? So the more you advertise, the more you sell. But similar to the pricing response functions we talked about in that module. Now similar here in this case, now you need to have some basic idea or you need to make some basic decision about the nature of the functional relationship, right? So what do you think is going to happen? Now the simplest form again would be a linear response function. Now we talked about that in pricing as well. Now linear functions are good because they're pretty easy to handle in terms of the calculations and you know, assessing slopes and so forth. Now, but in an advertising context, now linear response function is not realistic, right? Because it would mean I could, you know, the more I advertise, the more I sell, and this is in principle at least limitless. Now, of course, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, what's very more realistic to assume is, you know, either a digressive response function or an S-shaped response function, and we're going to talk about what these mean. Now, the digressive response function with a saturation level, now this implies some kind of concave relationship between advertising on the one hand and demand on the other hand. Now, so what these functions typically assume is that there's some kind of base demand, right? So even if you don't advertise, now at least some people will buy your products or services, right? And then you start investing into advertising and your sales go up, demand for your product goes up. Now, because in the beginning you are going to achieve greater returns, now you get a concave relationship. Now, so and I guess that makes sense, right? Now, let's assume, again, you have a smartwatch, you bring out a new smartwatch to the market, now you start advertising and you'll get all these tech-savvy people in the beginning, where they're just waiting to buy your watch. Now, you don't need to invest a lot of money to get these. Now, once you have them, let's say getting additional customers who may not be as keen on getting a new smartwatch, now this may be more difficult, meaning you can get them, now, but you need to make a bigger effort, right? So eventually, you know, because it's realistic to assume, there will be some kind of saturation level, and the response function will get closer and closer to the saturation level. Another kind of response function, which I think is equally likely or probably more realistic, is what they call an S-shaped response function, right? So again, as in the previous function, they will assume some level of base demand, right? Now, but now the slope of the function evolves differently. So what they assume in these kinds of functions is now you start investing in advertising, nothing much happens, right? So the slope doesn't really grow that much. It's pretty slow to grow. And I think if you think about marketing, about the way marketing is done in many markets, that makes sense, right? Now let's go back to the smartwatch. Now, even in a country of 82 million people, you know, getting noticed is very difficult, right? Because there's many companies out there trying to get, you know, our money as customers, and lots of advertising, right? Now let's assume you try to build, you come to me and say, Professor Wentzel, I want to build a new brand, I want to build something like Apple, can you help me? And I would say, well, at least I can try, and I would ask you, how much money do you have? And you say, well, I got €1 million to invest in advertising for building a super brand like Apple. And I would say, well, you know, just don't. I mean, that's money thrown down the drain. There's nothing you can do for building a brand with €1 million. Just think of the numbers from the beginning, how much Procter & Gamble spends on advertising each year, and these guys know their marketing, right? So meaning, in the beginning, nothing much happens, right? So there's no reaction in the market, but it's just not enough to get noticed. Now, eventually, it will start climbing rapidly, and then we'll reach an inflection point, and will then evolve similarly as the digressive response function we talked about before, right? Now, but again, so why am I telling you this, or why am I showing you this? Now, this may be having some idea about these functions. Now, this is important for you to decide how much money will I need to invest if you consider it as an investment? And again, so what is my assumption about the relationship between advertising on the one hand and demand on the other hand? Now, and also keep in mind that getting this kind of data, right, is now becoming more and more feasible. So how to construct these functions. Now, many of these things can be measured. So if you look at the big online retailers like Amazon or companies like Facebook, now they have units that do nothing all day long but analyze this kind of data, right? So what do we do in terms of our communications? What do we sell on the other hand? And how can I connect these two kinds of data sets in order to optimize my own marketing? So again, this is not something purely nerdy that will come out of a researcher's brain, but I think it's an area that's becoming more and more important in terms of how we think about marketing communications and to give it more analytical nature than it has before.